By the second roundup, the men who had wagered her gone by spring would stand at the rail fence and watch her count her own cattle, and they would not say a word. She did not know that yet. On the first cold morning of that hard season, Nell Hart stood alone in the ranch yard, with the whole town's verdict already settled against her, a widow of 27, who had buried her husband 3 weeks before the calves were due. The ground was stiff with early frost. Her breath hung white in front of her, and behind her, on the weathered gate-post where Jacob had left them the morning he died, his worn leather work gloves sat folded over the top rail, stiff now with cold, holding the exact shape of his hands. She had not moved them. She could not yet make her own hands do it. In town they had a saying for places like hers, and by the end of that first week the saying had a name in it. They called the Hart Ranch a widow's debt waiting to be paid. Adelaide Crisp, the banker's wife, said it kindest of all, which was how everyone knew it was meant to cut. A woman cannot work a cattle ranch alone, she told the women at the general store, her voice soft as warm bread. It is no shame to sell while the land still fetches a fair price. The men nodded into their coffee. Garrett Vane, who ran 600 head on the next section over and wanted 600 more, said nothing at all. He only smiled and waited, the way a patient man waits at a card table when he already knows the other player's hand. Nell heard all of it second-hand, the way the judged always do. She did not argue. She had learned young, from a father who broke horses and asked nothing of anyone, that explaining yourself to people who have already decided is a kind of begging, and she would not beg. So she did the work instead. She rose before light and split the ice on the trough with the flat of an axe. She forked hay to the gaunt winter cattle and walked the fence line where the wire had gone slack, and she did the arithmetic of survival at the kitchen table by lamplight, the same ledger Jacob had kept, the figures in his hand and then, lower down, in hers. There was feed enough for the herd until the thaw if nothing went wrong. Something always went wrong. The well pump had begun to clank and catch. The barn roof had lost shingles in the last wind, and the note Jacob had signed in the autumn, the one she had found only after, came due in the spring, and she did not yet know whose name was written as the holder. She kept the gloves on the gate-post where she could see them from the window. Some mornings she put her own bare hand flat against them before she went out, not for luck, only to remember the size of the work a man had once carried, and to measure herself against it without flinching. The leather had cracked along the seams and gone pale at the fingertips where Jacob had gripped 1,000 ropes and 1,000 cold gate latches, and the cold had made them hard as wood, and still she would not bring them inside. To bring them in would be to admit he was not coming back to put them on. She was not ready to admit it to the gloves, though she had said it to the ground at the burying with a dry face while the town watched and stored it up. Let them watch. She had cried where no one could see once, the night after, in the barn with her face against the warm neck of his horse. And then she had washed her face in the cold trough and gone back to the ledger, and she had not cried since. There was no time in a hard season for a woman to be seen breaking. The cattle did not care who had died. The ice closed over the trough every night the same. The drifter came on the 5th day, on foot, leading a sound bay horse he would not ride because it had thrown a shoe, and he would not lame it for his own ease. That was the first thing she noticed about him before his face. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, perhaps 34, with a lean, weathered look and a short, dark beard, and eyes that took in the whole yard in one pass and gave nothing back. He stopped at the gate. He looked at the gloves on the post for a moment longer than a stranger should have, and then he looked at her. He asked if she was hiring. She told him plainly that she could pay only a hand's wage, and only until the thaw, that the work was hard, and the house was a widow's house, and there would be talk. He said talk did not feed cattle. He said he would sleep in the barn and ask nothing else. It was the longest string of words she would hear from him for a week. She looked at his hands, which were a working man's hands, scarred across the knuckles and sure, and she thought of the empty stalls and the slack fence and the calves that would come whether she was ready or not. She said the work started before light. He said he was already awake. And so the arrangement was made at the gate, temporary, on a plain wage, the way a thing is made when both people are too proud to call it what it is. The old dog decided it before she did. Captain was Jacob's dog, a gray-muzzled cattle dog who had not eaten right since the burying, and who growled low at every man who came up the lane to make an offer on the place. When the drifter crossed the yard that first evening with his saddle over his shoulder, the dog rose stiff from the porch boards, and Nell put her hand out to call him back, certain of what was coming. The dog crossed the dirt instead, slow and deliberate, and lay down in the open doorway of the barn where the man would sleep, and put his head on his paws and let out a long breath he had been holding for 3 weeks. The boy saw it too. Toby was 12, an orphan Jacob had taken on the year before to learn the work, all knees and suspicion, and he had decided in advance to hate any man who thought he could step into Jacob's boots. He watched the dog from the fence rail with his arms crossed. He did not say anything. But he came down off the rail, and that was the start of it, though none of them would have said so. The days fell into a rhythm with no name. The man was up before her, which she had thought impossible. By the time she came out with the lamp, the ice was already broken on the trough and the hay already forked, and he was on the barn roof in the gray light. Laying new shingles, he had split himself from a fallen cedar, and he had not asked her for the nails. She found the well pump fixed one morning, the clank gone, the handle moving clean, and he never mentioned it, and she never thanked him, because to thank him would have been to admit she had needed it, and they had not yet arrived at a place where that could be said. This was the shape of the whole thing. He left coffee on the kitchen step before dawn, and was gone to the far field before she opened the door. He mended the gate latch the boy had broken, and said it had only needed tightening. She kept his supper warm on the back of the stove on the nights the work ran late, and set it out without comment. And he ate it without comment, and the dog lay between them under the table, and the boy talked enough for all 3 of them. It was not happiness, exactly. It was something steadier than that, the way ground feels steady under a house that has stood a long time. She caught herself on the 4th day, listening for the particular sound of his axe on the trough ice before she was fully awake and being eased by it, and she did not let herself think too long about what it meant to be eased by the sound of another person in the dark. The gloves stayed on the gatepost. Some evenings she saw the man pause at the gate and look at them, and once she saw him reach as if to move them, and stop and leave them where they were. And she understood that he knew somehow that they were not his to touch, and that this was the most honest thing anyone in that valley had done for her since the burying. The boy tested him the way the wounded test a thing they want to trust. Toby left a gate open on purpose to see if the man would blame him, and 3 of the yearlings got into the low meadow, and the man said nothing about the gate. He only handed the boy a coil of rope and showed him, without scolding, how to turn a stubborn yearling with patience instead of fear, how to read the animal's eye and give it somewhere to go. They brought the 3 back before noon. The boy waited all afternoon for the punishment that did not come, and at supper he asked the man straight out why he had not yelled, and the man set down his fork and said that a frightened animal runs and a frightened boy lies, and neither was any use on a ranch, so he had no use for fear. Toby thought about that for a long while. Then he asked if the man had ever had a boy of his own. The kitchen went still. The man looked at his plate. He said once, a long time ago, and he did not say any more, and Nell, who had learned the whole language of things left unsaid, did not let the silence break on him. She rose and filled his coffee he had not asked for, and set it down at his elbow, and the man looked at the cup, and then at her, and something in his face moved once and went still again. The dog sighed under the table. Outside the wind came down off the high ground and found the loose place in the eaves, and inside it was warm, and no one said the word for what the room had become. It was Garrett Vane who broke the season open the way she had known he would. He came up the lane on a fine horse on a gray afternoon, and he did not get down, because getting down would have meant they were equals. He had heard, he said, about the man she had taken on. He said it was a hard thing for a young widow alone, the talk, and he would hate to see her good name spent on a stranger nobody knew. Then he came to the point, because patient men always do in the end. The note her husband had signed in the autumn, he said, the one for the feed and the breeding stock, had come to him by way of the bank. He held it now. It came due at the spring sale, and the sum was more than the ranch could clear in a hard year, and he would be sorry, truly sorry, to have to take the land for the debt when she could sell it to him whole and walk away with something in her pocket and her dignity intact. It was the kindest threat she had ever been offered. She stood very straight in the yard, with her bare hand resting on the cold gloves on the gatepost, and she told him she would meet the note at the sale. He looked at the gloves and at her hand on them, and he smiled the patient smile, and said the spring would tell, and rode away. And here is the thing the whole town had wrong, and that she herself did not learn until that night. The man had heard it all from the barn door. When Vane was gone, he came across the yard, and he stood at the gate a moment, looking at the gloves the way he always did, and then he said the most words he had said since he came. He said he knew the brand on her cattle. He said he had ridden for her husband once, 8 years back, on a long drive up to the railhead in a bad year, that Jacob Hart had pulled a sick man out of a flooded river crossing on that drive, and never once asked to be paid back or even thanked, and that the sick man had carried the debt of it ever since, looking for the place to set it down. He said he had come up this valley by chance and seen the brand on the gatepost cattle and known the ranch before he knew it was hers, before he knew the man was dead. He had not stayed for the wage. He had stayed because a debt does not end when the man you owe it to is buried. It only changes hands, the way the gloves on the post had changed hands, the way the note in Vane's pocket had changed hands. Nell stood in the dark and understood at last why a silent man had broken ice and fixed a pump and asked for nothing. It was not pity. It had never been pity. It was a man paying back a kindness to the only family the dead man had left, and that was a thing she could stand on without it costing her her pride. She did not thank him for that either. She only said the sale was in 3 weeks, and they had work to do, and he said yes, and the matter was settled between them in the way that mattered. The cold deepened, and the calves came. They came in the worst of it, in a night of sleet that turned the yard to glass, and the man and the woman and the boy worked through it together in the lantern light of the calving shed. And twice a cow went down that should have died, and twice the man's sure scarred hands and her own steady ones brought a slick living calf into the straw and rubbed it, breathing. By the gray of morning there were 9 new calves standing on wobbling legs, and not one lost, and the 3 of them stood in the steaming shed, too tired to speak. There was blood to the elbows and straw in their hair, and the warm animal smell of birth filling the cold shed, and the lantern guttered low, and the sleet ticked against the boards, and none of it mattered against the small, wet sound of 9 calves breathing. The woman's hands had stopped shaking only because there was no more work left in them to do. The boy was asleep on his feet against the dog. The man looked at the woman across the new life in the straw, and she looked back, and neither of them looked away, and the season had turned even though the snow had not. Word of it got to town, because word always does. They said the widow had not lost a single calf in the killing sleet, and the men who had wagered her gone shifted in their chairs and said it was luck. And Adelaide Crisp said it kindest of all that it was a shame the girl would lose it all at the sale regardless, and Garrett Vane polished the note in his pocket and counted the days. But the gloves stayed on the gatepost, frost stiff and waiting, and under them the herd had grown by 9, and a thing that had been called a widow's debt had quietly become a working ranch again, though only 3 people and a dog knew it yet. The spring sale came on a bright, hard morning with the whole valley standing along the rail of the stockyard to watch a widow fail in public. Nell Hart rode in at the head of her own cattle with the boy on one side and the silent man on the other, and she sat her horse straight, and her late husband's gloves were tucked now into her own belt, because that morning, at last, she had been able to take them down off the post. Garrett Vane was there with the note in his hand, and the easy certainty of a man who has already won. He presented it to the auction clerk before the whole crowd, the sum named aloud so all could hear how far past her means it ran. And then the man who never spoke stepped forward, and he did not make a speech because loyalty proven in speech is no proof at all. He led out a string of cattle nobody in the valley had known she owned, prime stock he had been quietly bringing through the winter on the far grass, hers by the brand, and the count of them and the count of her calves together cleared the note, and more, there at the rail, in the open, with the whole town storing it up to tell later. The clerk read the tally twice. Vane looked at the figure, and at the woman, and at the gloves in her belt, and the patient smile finally left his face, and he folded the paid note and put it away, and did not meet her eyes. He did not speak. He only got into his fine saddle and rode back toward his 600 head, and the town let him go, and turned to look at the widow they had been so sure of, and found her counting her own cattle, and said nothing at all. It was nearly a month later, when the frost had gone out of the ground, and the first green was coming up in the low meadow, that the man came to the gate where she stood in the evening light. He had his hat in his hands, which she had never seen, and he said the debt he had carried was paid now, paid full, and that meant his reason for staying was gone, and he would not hold her to a thing she had only agreed to until the thaw. He said it plainly, looking at her and then at the ground, that if she wanted him to go, he would go in the morning and trouble her no further, and that whatever she chose, he would think no less of her for it, and nobody would hurry her. It was the longest he had ever spoken, and the gentlest, and it cost him to say it. She could see that. She looked at him a long moment in the falling light. She looked at the ranch behind him that they had pulled through the winter together, and at the boy mending tack in the lit barn doorway, and at the dog lying in the dust at the man's feet, where it had lain every night since the first. Then she took her husband's worn gloves from where they hung now on a peg by the door, and she did not give them back to the post, and she did not give them to the man because they were not his and never had been. She set them in the boy's hands instead, to keep, because the boy was the one who would carry the work forward, and that was where they belonged. And to the man she said only that the thaw was over, and the planting was just starting, and she had never said the work was finished, and if he wanted to stay, it would not be for a debt, and it would not be temporary, and he could sleep in the barn one more night if he liked, but only one, and after that there was a place for him at the table, and in the house, and in whatever years they had, if that was what he chose. He looked at her for a long time, then the corner of his mouth moved once, the way it had been trying to for a whole season, and he set his hat back on his head, and he said he was already home. The dog thumped its tail in the dust. Up at the house the boy had hung the gloves where he could see them over the back of Jacob's chair, and somewhere in the dark the well pump clanked once and ran clean. They built the rest of it slowly, the way they had built everything, a wedding in the green meadow with the whole quieted town invited, and most of them come, a ranch that grew year over year, until even Garrett Vane bought his breeding stock from them, a boy who grew tall and stayed, and never once let go of the work or the gloves that had taught his hands their shape. The town stopped calling it a widow's debt. They called it the Hart place, as if they always had. That was tonight's story from the Hearth and Homestead. And if it warmed you, pull your chair up again soon and tell me in the comments which of them you think was the first to know.